Hey club members, ready for a kitty meal prep? Let's see what prepping a week's worth of food for my adult cat Tangy looks like. In this video, I'll go through my prep from start to finish so you know exactly what to do when you start meal prepping. Let's begin. So the first step is to pull any meats that you have in your freezer out so you can see what you can incorporate into your recipe. There's no need to purchase meats that you already have. Once you do this, then you can go shopping for the remaining meats that you need. Some preps I'll make a recipe beforehand and then shop for each ingredient, and sometimes I'll go shopping, see what I can find, and then create the recipe after. For this prep, I went shopping first. What you should make sure to have during meal prep is 1 to 2 different types of meaty bones, 2 to 3 different types of animal proteins for the muscle meat, at least 1 muscular organ, 1 type of liver, and 1 second secreting organ meat. This is the base of the raw diet. You also want to shop for a few whole foods to help balance the meal. So these are things like fish and shellfish. And you also want supplements to fill any nutrients that are still low. So I figured out what I needed by making a recipe on my meal formulator, which you are welcome to use, along with my free cheat sheets and YouTube videos that go over balancing. So the bulk of my muscle meat, meaty bones, and second secreting organ came from a local market in my area. I got pheasant meat and head from purepheasant.com. The duck wings and salmon I got from my local Asian market, and the whole quail, ground beef, beef liver, and whole rabbit came from a few different local farmers at the farmers market. So there are quite a few options to find meats online or in your area. So after I go shopping, I put the meats that I bought in the fridge to keep them cool, and I put the frozen meats from the freezer into the sink to thaw quickly. Normally, I suggest thawing everything in the fridge, but if you're in a hurry, thawing in the sink is fine to do if you're keeping an eye on it. If you're thawing your meat in the fridge, I highly suggest getting a plastic bin or basin. That way, if any myoglobin seeps out, it won't get all over the fridge. Alright, now that everything is thawed, I'm going to take all of the meats out and put them on my prep table. To keep your prep area tidy, clean, and easy to grab each meat, open all of the packages and place everything into an individual container. Okay, now that the meats are all set, it's time to take a look at what items you need during meal prep. An apron so nothing splashes onto your clothes. As you can see, mine is a bit dirty, so it's definitely due for a wash. You of course can get any type of apron, but I got this one from Pets Galore Studio on Etsy. A gram scale, which is used for measuring out supplements. This one I got off of Amazon and it was pretty cheap, so it's definitely worth the purchase. A butcher knife for chopping meaty bones, and a sharp chef's knife for cutting everything else. So what I recommend is just getting a regular butcher knife from like any store, and maybe investing a little more money for a chef's knife since you'll be using that one a lot more. What I like to use are Meissen knives, which are a little more expensive, but I notice a big difference in how often I have to sharpen them. I've had this knife for almost 2 years now, and I've only had to sharpen it like maybe 3 times. A knife sharpener in case your knife starts feeling dull. This was another pretty cheap purchase off of Amazon, and it works as well as I needed to. Of course, a scale to weigh out the meats as well as the meals once you're done prepping. Yet another cheap purchase that has worked really well for me so far. Gloves. Sometimes I use them, most of the time I don't, but I do have a cut on my finger, so I'm using them today. A cutting board. I always recommend the ones with the groove on the outside because it catches any myoglobin that seeps out. Prep containers, and reusable Ziploc bags in case you have meats that are left over. You can get these off of Amazon as well, but I did get these from TJ Maxx for an even better price. Using plastic or glass containers are fine for leftover meat, but for meats that were in styrofoam packaging wrapped in cellophane, these baggies are great. So for the prep containers, I used to actually use these plastic ones, and I do still have them for when I run out of the glass ones, but I switched to glass because they're much easier to clean and keep sanitary, so I highly recommend these. I also have a few supplements here which I will go over in a bit. So, after you have your meats and items out, it's time to set out the meal prep containers and get ready to start prepping. Here is what I'll be feeding Tangy for this prep. For the meaty bones, I have quail. For the muscle meat and muscular organ, I'm feeding pork chops, beef round, pheasant breast, ground beef, and beef heart. I always like to have a good mix between ruminant animals and poultry just to provide a lot of variety. But Tangy is partial to ruminant animals, so I keep the majority of his meats red meat. For the liver, I'm feeding beef liver because it's high in copper, unlike poultry liver, and I'm feeding beef kidney because it's decently high in iron and very high in B vitamins. I'm feeding salmon to provide omega-3s and vitamin D. Then I have a few supplements which I will go over later. Alright, what I suggest doing before adding to your prep containers is cutting up some of your meats and meaty bones into smaller chunks. This makes meal prepping go a lot quicker. For this prep, I will be doing a week's worth, but if I have anything left over after Matsu and the ferrets prep, I will make a few more meals. I always add the raw meaty bone first, so it's time to start cutting up the quail into chewable pieces for Tangy. Now, because there's no bone data on quail, I can't say for sure how much calcium is in them. However, I do know their bone to meat percentages, so I'm going off of this to know how much I need to feed to keep the meal around 6 to 7% bone. Next up is the liver, which you only need a tiny bit of to meet the vitamin A and copper requirements. Next is the kidney, which can be fed a bit more than liver because it's not as crazy concentrated in nutrients. B vitamins are also water soluble, so any excess will be excreted in the urine. Next is the muscular organ of the meal, beef heart. Heart is a great taurine and iron booster and is overall pretty rich in nutrients. So just a little adds a lot to the meal. Next is the ground beef. Whenever I feed ground meat, I usually buy 90% meat and 10% fat. But for cats, something a bit higher in fat is fine to feed as they have a higher fat requirement than dogs do. In general, I try to keep the fat percentage of the meal around 10 to 12%. Then we have pork chops, which many owners are afraid of. This is usually because of the fear of parasites and Odrzyjewski's disease. However, in the US, these are two things that are very regulated, so the pork that's sold for human consumption is perfectly fine to feed raw. If you live in a country where you aren't sure of the quality of your pork, you will need to check how your country regulates their swine and inquire about Odrzyjewski's disease and the parasite Trichinella. Pork is high in many B vitamins, sodium, and potassium. Then the beef round, which is just a red meat boost to the meal. And next is the pheasant breast, which Tangy likes much more than chicken and turkey. For this recipe, I did skip the chicken thigh since Tangy has been picky lately. Next is salmon. Many owners ask me if this is something that should only be fed 1 to 2 times a week, or if it should be fed daily. So this all depends on how much you're feeding. A very small amount of salmon, mackerel, or sardines can meet omega-3s and vitamin D requirements. So if you're feeding a large amount of fish in one meal, you won't need to feed any more for another few days to a week. Since I try to balance daily, I feed just the right amount of fish each day. I usually rotate between Atlantic salmon and mackerel since these are the highest in vitamin D. Be careful not to feed salmon from the Pacific Northwest, as it may contain a bacteria that causes something called salmon poisoning. So after prep, I put all of the lids on Tangy's containers and I put every container but 2 into the freezer. After I prep Matsu and the ferret's meals, it's cleanup time. So what I do first is bag any meats that are in styrofoam containers into my reusable bags. Then anything that's too big to fit goes into a glass storage container. I try to create as little waste as possible, but when it comes to styrofoam containers that meats come in, I just can't help that. So I bag all of the trash and then put all of the containers, knives, and cutting board into the sink to rinse, then put them in the dishwasher. All of my leftover meat goes into the freezer for next prep. I try to use up all of the meat that I can during prep, but freezing and thawing is fine to do a few times. Just be sure to smell it to make sure it doesn't smell rotten or spoiled. Then I use a hand towel or paper towel if I have to clean any surfaces that touch the meat. I suggest using a natural all-purpose cleaner that kills bacteria like these two. Then go over that with antibacterial soap a few times. Okay, let's talk about the supplements that I'm using for this recipe. Supplements like this are best added at mealtime. So for this prep, I have kelp powder for iodine, zinc picolinate for zinc, liquid manganese for manganese, eggshell powder for additional calcium, and vitamin E oil for vitamin E. And voila! That is what Tangy's meal prep usually looks like. I hope this can help you on your meal prepping journey.